this particular chart before. Okay, fine. That's the causes of mortality in the army in the Eastern Crimea campaign. This is battlefield. This is illnesses in the hospital. This is other causes, and you can see the the overwhelming mortality from the hospitals. And that brings the second point, that there are many uses of graphs. And obviously, in visual analytics, we're mostly interested in using visualizations to understand things, to learn something new, to look at the data and see something that we didn't know before. But also, after that, there's a different use with different purposes, maybe with different visualizations, to explain what we found out to other people, to communicate the ideas, to educate, which is explain with the added requirement of long-term retention. It needs to sit in your memory. Okay? Convince. Sometimes all you need is to make your point. Just not necessarily even explain the truth, just to make your point. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be the truth. And I really invite you to look at the books on visualization in the courtroom, which provide a wealth of information of how to use available visual tools to do what you want with whatever data you're given. I mean, if we think that a little data messaging is a crime, then look at this book, What They Do in the Law. I mean, it's just.
Have you got a reference for it?
There are several. I'm not providing them. I've leafed through 3, and they're all good.
We can get the reference later, I guess.
You can get the reference later, but yeah, it's in my thesis. You've read it.
Oh, yes, it is.
Sorry. And that leads me to one of the things that I kind of realized at some point quite later with dealing with visualizations recently. I used to think that beauty and usefulness are opposing concepts. That a visualization is either beautiful or useful. And then when I started to think about all the other things, for example, in education, when we know that aesthetic qualities of a visual help in long-term memory. The better it looks, the easier it is to remember it. Okay? And then in education, it is important that things are beautiful. In impressing and convincing people, of course. In impressing especially. And now, I would say it's more or less, two orthogonal axes. One is the wow aspect, how beautiful it is, and one is the eureka aspect, how useful it is. And you can get things that are both. This is a telecom graph over UK, which is rather nicely drawn and really helps you to see the nexuses of sometimes it's just useful. This is not a very beautiful one, but it helps you understand if you're a biologist. If you're a cancer biologist, it helps you understand stuff. That's just beautiful. This thing looks very impressive, but it was submitted for a visualization art contest. So it has absolutely no real data or real meaning behind it. And then you have the UN Committee for Agriculture, which is an example of how graphs shouldn't be made. Of that thing. I mean, I actually did it as an exercise of, try to dig out the data from that and then draw it so it actually makes some sense. And it takes about an hour and a half for a team of 5 to understand what's going on and then represent it in a digestible format. They're brilliant. They're just, if you go to the site of the UN Agriculture and Food Commission, it's a wealth of examples of how not to do visualizations. As many people before me, I would like to present my own visualization of what I think visualization is about. Start with the general context, which quite a few people actually omit. Without visualizations, the general context is that there is the world, And there is, I know people don't like the word user, worker, human, a sapient, a thinking individual, okay, a mind. Actually, a mind. There's a mind and there's a world. And there's interaction between the mind and the world in that the world requires something. There's some need, some task, and there's some action to respond. And the task can be from your supervisor, from the need, from yourself. There's a task that something needs to be done, and then you do it. Okay? And this is the overall context that is important in visualization context. Then inside that mind, there's all kinds of things happening, which I'm very interested in as a psychologist. There is the context that the user brings to the story. There's the goals, there's the expertise, there's memories, there's acquired things. And these affect how we perceive the world, how we create the information from the perception, how perception goes into information, leading to decision and to action. So this loop, just to detail this a bit from the user point of view. Okay? And I'm using information in a pre-Shannon meaning, something that is in the mind, not something that a computer can do. That's a bit of confusion in terms. But some people use knowledge for what's inside your mind, and information for something that is stored digitally, and data is something, and world. Now, at last, we come to visualizations that replace direct perception of the world with a three-part process. First, we measure some aspect of the world, creating data, visualize it for a display, graph, chart, visual image, sonic, doesn't matter, something that is not the world, that something that's processing, and then perceive that. Okay? And lastly, last bit is sometimes decision. It doesn't affect the world, but affects the display first. Okay? The decision of the action that we take is to change the visual. So the user decides to look at it from another angle, do another thing with the data. Okay, and so there are three loops in here. There's the overall action, task and action loop. You ask to do something, you need to do something, and you do it. You ask to compile a report on what's going on with the migration of whales in Arctic, and you do that. There is the loop of interaction with the actual tool, where you change the visuals, you change the presentation of the data, you see what's going on. And then there is a smaller loop within your head of looking at stuff, thinking, deciding, understanding, and we'll talk about that mainly. But first, the central thing in here, the visualization function.
There's one step missing there, isn't there?
Which one?
Which is the data is not raw data frequently, it's manipulated data.
Yes.
So you're actually interacting with that and the visualization, and
yeah.
Sometimes simultaneously.
Yeah, there are two steps in here.
Yeah.
There's raw data, processed data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you're changing the.
Yeah. Sometimes you change the processing, and then you change the visualization, and then you see what's going on. Sometimes you change the measurement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who formulates the task?
And depends on who is the user. Depends on who you
The
are.
task goes from world to user. So it's in this context of your model, is a task that is something that is given to the user, or is
Something that is external, yeah.
so the user isn't a sort of creative task creator.
Sometimes it is, but in context of visual analytics specifically, where you see the analyst as part of a larger organization, okay, as a cog in the machine, you get something from the outside. Okay. In the context of research, quite often you do formulate your own tasks, and then all of this is more inside your head. Yeah, but you're right, but I'm more interested in this bit, some kind of shortening goal. Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating area in metrology of how you measure things precisely is a fascinating area. What you said is a great stats. With huge respect and all that, but I'm more focused on here. I said that's my roadmap of what's going on in there. Okay? So, visualization function. In the process of visualizing data, the process is there are variables in the data and there are parameters of the display. And here, for scatter plot, so that's like scatter plots, we have x, y position, shape, size, color. Anything else for scatter plot? I think that's all you can cram into a scatter plot. These are all the parameters of the display. And whatever you have in the data, and you kind of mix and match them. That's a visualization function that maps data into visual. Trivial stuff, you know that. Importantly, every variable on both sides comes with metadata. Things like range, type, it's categorical, it's continuous, does it have a zero, does it have an order, and all that. And it is possible to use this metadata to map things more intelligently, and there are tools that do that for you, that take the metadata, for example, the range or the type of these two, and then try to match them so that it makes sense. And sometimes that leads to very interesting predicaments. There was a very nicely conducted research that investigated 3D scatter plots, and that mapped six continuous variables of the data onto 6 continuous variables of the scatter plot, x, y, z, RGB. Okay, and theoretically, from the visualization point of view, from the display point of view, RGB are as much as x, y, z. Continuous variables with more or less the same range, 1 to about hundreds-ish, with a 0 at the beginning, not in the middle, and all of that. And the results were that people can easily distinguish between X, Y, Z, and they really cannot distinguish between R, G, and B, which is somewhat unsurprising because everything was kind of pinkish-violet. You can't really say which of the pinkish-violets is more blue than the other. Okay? It was very well-conducted research, and it provided well-founded results. It just, okay, fine. It kind of drives home the point that the important thing in this mapping is not mapping to the parameters of the display, but rather mapping to the perceptual space, the parameters of the information, where color is not RGB, it's hue and brightness. And while brightness or saturation are continuous, have a 0 and have a maximum range, hue isn't. It's, first of all, categorical, and second, heavily culturally dependent. How many different colors are there is culturally dependent, is language dependent, and all that. Moreover, distances between colors are culturally dependent. Which colors are close, perceptually close to each other, which ones aren't, which ones are opposite, is culturally dependent. I've read a lovely paper on perception of color in medieval Europe recently, and was surprised to find that then rich colors and faded colors were much more distinct than they are now. So, for example, rich blue and rich yellow were perceptually together and very different from pale, faded blue and faded yellow. That was the color for the nobility, that was the color for the poor man. Well, okay. And that brings in the saturation into the play of which colors are perceptually together. Anyway, that just to make the point that what we really want and what we really should think about is how to map the parameters of the data into the parameters of the perceptual parameters that are different from display sometimes. Okay. We have, instead of XY position, we have spatial arrangement. Okay, and spatial arrangement in vertical. Vertical spatial arrangement has a clear zero at the bottom. There's up and there's clear down. Horizontal arrangement doesn't have a clear zero at one side, it has a zero in the middle. There's left and right, and people do confuse between these two, but there's a very clear zero in the middle, etc. Maybe the most important parameter of like metadata of the perceptual variables is its salience. Some variables, some parameters of the perceptual objects don't matter. Okay. For example, in the previous slide, if the shape is not a diamond but a cross, that's not a big deal. Okay. So if you don't map anything to it, you substitute default values. Doesn't matter. Color in this particular one doesn't really matter unless you make something very strong with it. But in some cases, the variables of the perceptual field are so salient that you can't assign default values. And here the whole most of Kaiju's lecture is about that. The position is such a salient feature, you can't randomize it. You have to think long and hard where to put things, because you can't. If you don't have position in your data, you can't just assign it randomly. Okay, because this is such a salient stimulus, such a salient parameter of the stimulus, that even if it's not important, you can't disregard it. You look at it, and it is important because it's position. Okay. Now, okay, of course, what we really want to do is to assign. There is also the same difference between parameters of the data and parameters in the world, but that's metrology again. That's a different story. We assume that the parameters of the variables of the data are what we deal with. Okay. Now, why do I spend so much on visualization function? First of all, because I think that explicitly specifying your visualization function is a good way to start working with data. Just writing it down. Okay? What I have with data, what I have as my visualization parameters, what I map to what. Not necessarily how exactly, but the gender goes to shape. Location goes to color. Which color is a later consideration, but just what maps to what. And this way you can quite often detect bugs. Okay, as a former programmer, think in terms of debugging. You can find bugs in your visualization quite early in the design process when you explicitly specify your visualization function, what maps onto what. Find things that are not used and can be used for other things. Find things that can be confused and shouldn't be. For example, if you map very different things onto variables of the display that can be easily confused, like saturation and brightness. Okay, in color. There are two things that are distinct but quite easily confused. So that's one use of visualization function that I think is important. And the other is that we can take this visualization function and reverse it in our analysis of perception of graphs. You can take the insight, what you found, and use the same visualization function to see where it is in the graph. Okay, what you found in what the analyst has found in data terms, how does it translate to visual terms? Okay, so analyst that sees the same chart of causes of mortality says, "Oh my God, people are dying in the hospitals." But what can you see in the chart? We can use the same visualization function to say, okay, what you've seen in the chart visually is that this is much bigger than anything else. There's more blue, I believe, although we can't really see that, more blue than any other color. Okay? And that approach allows us to analyze visualizations on their own without going into domain specifics to some extent. We can compare, we can see the merits and problems with a given visualization technique regardless of the domain expertise. Okay. Because we mapped the insight from the domain of the insight of the expert from the domain to the visual using the same function. Does it make sense? Kind of, more or less? Okay. Because we kind of did that at the beginning of my PhD. We interviewed researchers, people who work with lots of data and use visualizations of some sorts, about their practices, about their research, about what they do and how they do it in a reasonably rigorous manner. It was semi-structured interviews. We asked questions, we then waited until people answer these questions fully to what they want, recorded that, analyzed, compared, used lots of sketches, asked people to draw their visualizations for us, and then focused on, the experts talked in terms of domain insights and domain findings, but we tried to forcefully kind of push them into telling us the visual insights, what they actually saw in the actual image that brought about this domain insight. Okay, that's an example of one of the plots, of one of the sketches, and it's a riverbed. And the domain insight is that this river has a bend in this particular bit, okay, and that there have been an error in the measurement somewhere along the way. And the visual insight is, the visual correlate of these things is that these not circles, thingies, are clustered towards the right. That's, from that you can see, if you're an expert, that there is a bend in the river. Okay? And also there's this point which is below the riverbed, which is obviously an error in measurement. Okay? So, we could, and then we recorded and tried to analyze what are the type of visual insights. So things clustered towards one side, things are not where they should be. Over several domains and several experts, not enough, but enough to draw some conclusions. And our results were that the main insights drawn from visualization were outliers. People visualize, researchers in our study visualize data predominantly to find outliers, clusters, and trends. And there are some, I'm not sure about recurrent patterns, whether they're clusters or trends, but predominantly outliers. Okay? So the visual parsing of a graph like this would be cluster, cluster, outlier, trend, trend. Okay? That, again, two clusters of which there are, in both of which there are trends, different trends, and two outliers here. Okay? Does that account of a visualization make sense? As a parsing of a visual, as a visual parsing. Now, from that, we can move on to the theory. To the theory that talks about how visual parsing works, how perceptual parsing works. Such a theory would try to formulate it so that it can enrich both theoretical accounts of comprehension, perception, cognition at large, and also practice of visual analytics. And here we'll talk more about the practice. Building on existing theories from reading and vision, because visualization is kind of both. It's kind of in between. Reading in the sense that it's abstract, symbolic, not pictures, not like real pictures of real things, and visual perception in that it's not overly symbolic. The spatial organization plays a lot of role. There is no, it doesn't translate directly to language and all that. So in between this, and I believe everyone knows about laws of Gestalt. Okay, and the Trisman's research about pop-out effect. And however, laws of Gestalt are this year 100 years old, and in these 100 years, there's been a lot of pure research, pure academic research into into what exactly are they, how to reformulate them better, and we'll talk about that. And the pop-out effect is about 30 years old, but already there is some criticism of Trisman's work, and there's some theories that might better explain what can be found. All these are kind of very, very theoretical and have to dig quite deep into psychology literature to find it, but I think they really apply well to visualization literature. Yes?
It may be worth explaining Trisman.
I will.
You were going to do
I will.
that.
Yeah, will do. Of course. I'm revisiting both. Let's start. I hope you'll see how these theories are better tools for understanding how visualization parsing works. Okay? First, let's start with laws of Gestalt. They're well known. Who hasn't seen this thing before? Ruben Weiss. Okay. Everyone knows them. They're part of cultural background. They're taught in courses from photography to media to psychology to whatever. And they are part of the problem with them is they're usually taught by illustration. Okay? See? That's vestibility. Okay. That's the illustration of vestibility, of perceptual vestibility when there are two possible interpretations of the scene. And except for actual psychology, it rarely goes beyond the illustration because the visual is just too good. The visual makes you go, understand what's going on. Okay? Which might not actually be true. I mean, just that the visual is good. It's so impressive, it makes you go, aha! Whereas the aha is about the image, not about your understanding. Okay? When I tried at some point to explain the laws of Gestalt without using any images, it was a very, very grueling task. And here is the result, okay? Laws of Gestalt without a single illustration. The parsing, principles of perceptual organization, how the parsing of visual scene works in a single slide. There are 4 processes that take place, and all these processes can take place in any order over each other, nested and built on top of each other. One is grouping. Objects or parts of objects are grouped according to their proximity, common motion, color, shape, etc. Then groups, one group can be designated as a figure and everything else fades into background. Okay? If grouping, if this figure is not complete and it is completed using illusory, using bits of objects that are not actually in the picture, but we kind of supply them. And there's an overall principle of economy of motion in the Prägnanz in German, which I don't pronounce properly, in that out of any given, 2 given solutions, the simplest one is usually preferred. For example, in figure ground segregation, it can be bistable, like here, but if there is one solution that is obviously better, then it is preferred and the other one is not considered. For example, if we draw full faces and reduce these bits here, this becomes a single solution, not a bistable solution. Okay. For example, I can't do without a picture here. Okay. These maybe slightly grouped by these bits, maybe slightly grouped by position, and there's also already some kind of illusory complement. We add more, becomes stronger. There's here we start to see grouping by shape into circles. Here, you know this bit. You know this bit? Okay. Yeah. Here, the resulting object, the resulting perceptual object, after you see that, is a cube, not a single part of which is actually in the image. It's not there. What is there is bits of black sectors, and what you see is a white three-dimensional cube. We can analyze in detail, but I would not go into details, on how exactly each bit is done using these 4 processes. Okay, and that's the principles of perceptual organization, which are simpler in some point, and quite simpler than the laws of Gestalt as they are taught. Because if you try to count the laws of Gestalt, there are hundreds of them. Someone actually tried to enumerate all the laws of Gestalt. There are about 200 to 300 of those. There are 4 principles of perceptual organization, and they can be rigorously tested. They have been rigorously tested. And instead of being developed by introspection by Wertheimer, with all due respect to Wertheimer, and they can be applied to visualizations. We can apply the same principles and see how things are grouped by proximity and color, how an illusory contour is created to accommodate the trend. And actually, they kind of become more or less synonymous. You can illusory contour and a trend is usually the same. Okay, outlier, favor ground segregation, and group. They kind of work. These things that people see in visualizations, outliers, clusters, and trends, and the laws of principles of perceptual organization. They're more or less talking about the same thing, the same process. This is the same data, but this one is parsed because there's a clear trend. This one cannot be parsed, obviously. Well, can be, but it takes time and effort. And so the question is, because they're so similar, how far is it from the parsing of the visual scene? Okay, if we do all the parsing according to the principles of perceptual organization, all that, how far is from that parsing to the actual meaning that we see in a graph? I would like to argue that it's not very far, if at all. That what we actually see is a result of the parsing on high levels. Okay. Second theory. Okay, that was the laws of Gestalt revisited. Now, in Treisman and Ghilardi's research from 1980s, there was found a very strong effect, pop-out effect. The fact that you can see the odd one out more or less immediately, regardless of how many destructors are there. In some cases, but not in other cases. You can see this O among this axis easily. A red one, probably yes, although I'm not sure how visible it is in this light. Red among black. But an odd one out here takes a long time to find, and takes longer the more destructors there are. Who sees the odd one out here? Okay, that's the thing. But it's very easy to quantify. You just increase the number and you see whether the reaction time stays the same or increases. And feature integration theory, proposed by Treisman, connects this effect with low-level basic features. Things that are very basic, like shape, pop out. Things that are conjugate, like being both a different color and a different shape, take time to find. However, in the recent 20 years or so, there's been enough evidence that, while supporting the whole idea of the pop-out effect, there is a pop-out effect and it's very clearly visible, casts some doubt on whether it is tied to the low level, because there's been quite enough evidence of the pop-out of high-level features, things that take some processing to detect. Have you found the odd one out in all four of these? This one? Yeah, here, here. Takes time. Here. Okay. The point is that this and this are very, very similar in terms of low-level features. Okay. These are 3 diamonds arranged in a same pattern and 3 hexagons arranged in a pattern. But because the high-level feature in here is different, it exists and here doesn't, this pops out and this doesn't. There's a high-level feature of 3-dimensional structure here and not here. Same here. Even more elaborate than 3-dimensional structure, there is evidence of pop-out of faces between buildings, even if face has been made more rectangular on purpose, and all other graphical components have been made as similar as possible. Flowers among tools, animals, all that. Things that are really, you can't call that low-level features anymore. Tools and cars. Okay, you can immediately recognize one from an array of others. Okay? So, to accommodate this contradicting evidence, there's been several explanations. One account is called the reverse hierarchy theory, and it describes perception as a bidirectional pipeline where, first of all, what happens is you build up a parsing using all the principles of parsing as high as you can. Okay? You go to the top level object that you can do automatically, and then if this object is not what you need, you drill down to lower levels to look for what you're looking for. But this first immediate perception is performed automatically, and it goes as far as high up as it can go. Okay? So if it can go to 3-dimensional objects, it will go up to 3-dimensional objects and will pop out the odd one out that is 3-dimensional at you. If it can't go, it will stop at hexagons. If it can go as high as facial recognition, it will go to facial recognition, present the odd one out in that it's a face or it's not a face. And then if that's not what you need to drill down, and that takes time. That drilling down takes time. Okay? So there's not a difference. The difference is not between a low level and high level, but between automated construction of the automated parsing and attended drill down. Okay? And that ties pop-out effect with the automated formation of high-level objects. And if we recall the point that I made, that formation of the higher-level objects in a visualization are not very different from the meaning of visualization, that connects that nicely. Okay, last theory, if you're alive yet. How are we with time?
You have about 15 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Last theory then. To bridge a bit between visual parsing and meaning, I have to bring in reading comprehension, or understanding of comprehension, that as a concept. What does it mean to comprehend something? And there is this model from the field of reading comprehension that says that in the lower levels it's a hierarchical build-up. At the higher levels, it's more of a network with 3 constraints. There is the input from what you see. there is your task, what you want to do, what you need to do, and there's your training expertise, previous memories, previous conditioning, and all that. And the higher you go in the hierarchy, from perception to cognition, comprehension, all that, the more your task and training play a role. Okay? Which is kind of almost right. Training plays lots of role in here, in lower levels, but it's a training that has been done when you were 1 year old, 2 year old, and it cannot easily be undone. The critical window of development has closed. Okay? So the training for seeing objects, three-dimensional objects, has been done, and you can't really undo it. The training for reading has been done. You can't easily undo it. You can't stop reading. Or a stroke task is a perfect example that you can't stop reading if you want to. But for more elaborate, more recent things, you can train, you can change your habits. The task is the basic idea for recent change, when something changes your settings of the perception. But by task, and this whole process changes. Okay? So, to summarize, that's a reasonable summary. It looks like a Christmas tree as well. First of all, we have the parsing of the visual scene, which goes as high as it goes, as high as it can go given a given scene. The higher it goes, the more effect you have of task and training, and most importantly, that parsing of what you see can be achieved either really fast through bottom-up process, or slowly, one by one, through top-down drilling. Okay, that's the overview. That's a summary and overview of what's going on. What happens when you see a visual, specifically a graph? What goes on in your mind when you see a chart? Goes up with automated parsing that is not easily changeable. And then, if it doesn't provide you with what you want, you need to drill down with attention to look for what you're looking for. Okay? Make sense? It's a oversimplification, but it might be a good model to apply to visualization, to visual analytics, because it's kind of okay. No, it's oversimplified, but it kind of works, and it works better, I believe, than applying laws of Gestalt, or not applying anything, than applying your rules of thumb, because as people told yesterday, you don't know. That's the introduction into liver function, okay? You don't really know how your brain works. That's a good enough model of how your brain works. Okay. The good thing about this is that it comes with its own quality criterion and its own measuring methodology. The quality criterion is that we would like the information that we're looking for to pop out. Would like the visualization to be built in such a way that the insights do not require a one-by-one serial search. We would like them to pop out and be available immediately, right? Kind of. And it is very easily tested for any given visualization technique. You can easily test whether this particular information pops out. So if you develop a new way of presenting data, or you have an existing way of presenting data, you want to check whether it works with the data, you pile up data points and check for reaction times, for detection time of whatever you're looking for. And if it doesn't matter how many data points you pile up, you're good. It's scalable, it's immediate, it doesn't require attention. If it goes up, maybe something needs to be tweaked. Maybe that's these parameters or this visualization function is not the optimal visualization function. The last 5 minutes ish.
Yeah.
The last 5 minutes. It should move. It doesn't move. Okay, that's an animated GIF that isn't. The experiments I did through my PhD were concerned with three-dimensional scatter plots. So imagine this is moving and is actually presenting you with 3D picture. Why? Because scatter plots are very, very common, widely used, two-dimensional scatter plots, I mean. Three dimensions, is very widely used because we live in 3 dimensions. I mean, that's what we do. You can't say people are bad in 3 dimensions because we're good at 3 dimensions. We navigate in 3 dimensions, we do that. But 3-dimensional scatter plots are horrible. They're useless, they don't really work, and I couldn't understand why. They kind of bugged me. So focused on outlier detection and then trend detection in 3-dimensional scatter plots. Because outlier detection is the most common task, I wanted to make sure it actually works for this most common task. You can actually see an outlier in a 3-dimensional scatter plot. And then, when it didn't work, I went to trend detection, because it's kind of one of the second common tasks. I won't go into detail over all the experiments. I can if you want, but there's no time. There's a summary. A 3D scatter plot. Again, imagine this is all moving and can be rotated and can be zoomed in and over. It's good for trend detection, especially trend detection, especially all kinds of 3-dimensional trends, like spirals, like this kind of trend that cannot be easily resolved into a 2-dimensional trend. Cups, manifolds and stuff. But not for outlier detection. You can't really easily see an outlier in this kind of 3D. And when we checked whether it makes more sense to give the interactivity, the control to a user, or just rotate the scene, it is better if the user can rotate the scene, or navigate himself. Mostly because it allows learning, not because because people can then change the way they rotate it to suit their needs and suit their own ways of 3-dimensional seeing to make it work. But if we gave them the possibility to do a full 3-dimensional rotation, so, kind of rotate it in all 3 dimensions, and contrast it with making just rotation around vertical axis, 3-dimensional looks awesome. It's absolutely brilliant and great, and it doesn't work. It takes about 2 seconds more to find out what you're looking for. Whereas just doing that is probably the best way to see in a 3-dimensional scatter plot. Just a tiny bit, because that's kind of what we do when we encounter a 3D object that we want to. If we don't really know the shape of, we do that. Okay, we don't go. And that's what our experimental results show. Using all this underlying theory and all this methodology. That's it.